It's with great pleasure I introduce Josh Dukart.
Well, thank you, Gabe, and I certainly appreciate those of you that have stuck around and provided feedback, filled out those evaluations, and I think that, well, I know that those things will be valuable to us. Now, I won't take just too much of your time, but I want to start off with a few questions for you. When you think of soil health, what do you think of? Earthworms. Good smelling dirt, and she still called it dirt. Living, soil, organic matter, life, energy, money. When you think of soil health, who do you think of? Ghostbusters. Everything else up to this point I've expected. That one was out of left field. Gabe Brown. Family. Chickens. Everyone. When you think of soil health, why do you think about it? It's a link to everything. You're made out of it. Its demise is our demise. Part of our biosphere. You see, over the last 3 days, up till this point, and including this last just awesome panel, my answers to those questions have expanded. Okay, I had my answers before this. But I tell you what, after the last 3 days, with the caliber of speakers that we've had, with the creativity, the expertise, the experience, and the commitment of everybody that's here, and for the most part, those that were here, it's pretty humbling to be not only a speaker here, but to try and tackle a topic like this, okay? Which, by the way, thank you, Gabe Brown, for, he tends to try and challenge me quite a bit. And most of the time I appreciate it, and I have to say this one has been a challenge. You see, I've had about 7 or 8 months of lead time to put together this presentation. So 10 o'clock last night when I got started on it, and 3 o'clock this morning when I finally went to bed and pulled my best Gabe Brown because I got back up at 5. I really struggled. And I struggled because I really didn't know where to go with this. I didn't know what to do. Okay, I had lots of ideas, lots of random ideas, but I didn't know what to do with them. And it wasn't until this morning that I started to come to some conclusions about why it was so tough to put this together. You see, we got to spend time in the field and in the pasture. We got to spend time in the classroom. We've heard about the biological part of all of this. We've heard about the technological part of all this. We've learned about monitoring on a site-specific scenario as well as a very broad and global perspective. We've had the opportunity to participate in a very in-depth, high-quality financial session for those of us that took that in. And last but not least, there's something that continues to pop up with every group, every panel, every speaker, and that's this thing called quality of life. I kind of like the sound of it. I think I ought to get me some of that, Greg. Anybody know where I can buy it? The exhibitors are gone, I think. I don't know if it was for sale out there or not, but I like the sound of that. So you see, I don't think that anything that's been talked about so far that I can say it any better than it's already been said. So what do I do? Well, I had to go back and think of some of the techniques and some of the tools that a lot of my mentors have used. And there's one mentor that came to mind, and this gentleman comes to mind quite often, and his name was Terry Gomper. And there's something, for those of you that participated in any of his educational sessions over the years, or holistic management classes, you know how he liked to open sessions, and you know what activity he liked to use to close sessions. And although this was a little bit different, when I asked you those 3 questions, I don't know if you realize, but I just put you through a modified Dukart opening circle. You see, if we would have done the true form of it, we would have put chairs all the way around the room to where we could see everybody, and you would have had the chance to answer those 3 questions on your own, with your own answers, in your own context, and we would have learned even more about each other. And we might have gotten done just in time to pack up and head to Michigan for next year's 2015 conference. But the thing is that he taught me is that you don't always have to be the best teacher, or the best instructor. You don't have to have all the answers. In fact, many times the questions are more important than the answers. And to have the freedom to ask a question and not necessarily consider it a failure if you don't find an answer, it's about that exploration phase that makes the biggest difference. Now, I still haven't gotten to what I'm going to try and do, because ultimately, when I figured it out, I realized that I'm really unqualified to talk about what I'm going to talk about. Okay? You got to realize that you're taking an introverted, former equipment and feedlot design engineer who's going to try and tackle one additional layer of all that we've talked about here in the last 3 days, and that's the psychology of all of it. Because we all probably know that we can throw money at things, we can throw policy at things, we can throw physical infrastructure at things, tools, practices, all those sorts of things, and they will go a ways. But like the late Dr. Dan Scow said, he said, you can get it in your mind, but unless you get it in your heart, you aren't going to get it in your field. And to me, that's pretty profound. Okay? It's kind of a big deal. So my goal over the next, 2.5 hours or so, if that's all right with you. You know, I picked up the cue cards, so I can give myself the 10-minute signal anytime that I really want. But I have one goal, and that over the next 30 minutes or whatever it takes to get through this, my goal is to wreck one particular statistic. On average, in any educational event, workshop, tour, conference, convention, you name it, there's a certain percentage of people that actually go home, implement enough change to make a difference. What do you think that percentage is? I've heard 1, I've heard 3, I've heard 5, 2. Quite honestly, any of those aren't real good, are they? Okay, I agree. But you know what the key word in all that, or key couple of words, was the fact that I said on average, it's 5% or less. And the longer you wait after you get home to do anything, the more that percent drops to actually do anything with the information that you got. But here's the thing. I don't think this group is average. With what I've seen over the last 3 days, this group is anything but average. Now, we might be oddballs at times, like Wayne brought up in his opening address. We might be abnormal at times, but I've just kind of embraced that now over the years. But we are anything but average, and quite honestly, someone's got to do it. Someone's got to start turning this thing around. Someone's got to steer the ship in a different direction and find out who's on, who's not, and we're going to focus on who's on. I would like to take that percentage from 5 and raise that up an awful lot. Who here wants to see that 5% be something higher. This is something that is going to be up to you. It's personal initiative. Now, what I'm going to cover, you may have seen before. You know, there's different people that get driven by different things. But this is the idea that we're going to push this thing far enough to where it creates a tipping point, if you will. Okay? But to start with, I think we need to identify a couple of the things that we're up against. Okay? Some of the challenges. And trust me, just like Paul Brown's presentation, we have to go through a little bit of a lull, a little bit of the doomsday, Debbie Downer part to identify what we're up against. But just like he did so wonderfully, we're going to come out on the other side and we're going to hit a peak that's even higher than where we're at now. But we can't be afraid to take it on, and we can't be afraid to be challenged. How many here would like to leave the land better than when they found it? Okay, wonderful, admirable. I get the same exact answer no matter what group I speak to. But let me ask you a secondary question. Is this actually happening across North America on a global scale? Guess which answer I get most of the time for this one? I actually get yes most of the time. Okay? There's your first clue of what we might be up against. Now, is this happening on individual operations in certain places? Yes. We saw 2 examples of those when we toured on Wednesday. I know of lots of other examples. But on a broad scale, this is something we need to work on. Not to beat on this too much more, but are these pictures from the past or from the present? It's kind of a trick question, but kind of not really, because the answer is both. Now, the picture in the lower left probably dates itself a little bit because the picture's in black and white. The problem is, in the last 2 years, I could take you to no less than 8 or 10 states, and I can show you the exact same thing. Picture in the upper left, Texas in 2012. Picture in the upper right, Western Rangeland state in the U.S. in the mid-90s. And not to be outdone, bottom right, Burleigh County, North Dakota. We're not an exception. That ditch right there behind this gentleman who is the district conservationist in Bismarck, North Dakota by the name of Jay Fear. Many of you maybe know him. That ditch is full of topsoil. Now, I guarantee you that our ag department really takes a lot of pride in its exports. I don't think this is one of the things that we should be exporting, and yet it doesn't get much media coverage. It doesn't get a lot of attention. How do we go about changing this? First thing I want you to do is I want you to look at this picture and look at it very carefully. How many see one face? And there's no wrong answer here. How many see one face? How many see 2 faces? How many see 3? Perception, reality, how we use our senses, how we see things. Earlier today, I think it was, and if it wasn't today, it was yesterday, they talked about how people can look at the same set of data and come up with 2 totally different interpretations. How you can have one set of research that supports this and another set of research that does exactly the opposite. So who do you believe? Well, we'll touch on that just a little bit. There was a presentation up in Canada, okay, a few years ago, and when I say up in Canada, I'm talking about North Canada. I was a couple hours into Saskatchewan and asked this gentleman, I said, is your ranch near here? And he said, yeah, not too far. And I said, and keep in mind, I'm from North Dakota, so Canada is kind of like the provinces are kind of like another state, okay, for us, because we're that close. But he was a couple hours into Canada at this conference, and I said, how close are you to here? And he said, well, or I asked him, I said, how many miles are you from here? And he said, well, first of all, we don't deal in miles. We deal in kilometers. But he said, we don't really measure things in kilometers. He said, we measure things in hours. And I'm like, oh, okay. Well, how far north? And he said, well, not very far, just about 8 hours north of here. 8 hours north? Okay, yeah, we're neighbors. That's right. But he made a very profound statement in his presentation. And he said, if you want to make small changes, change how you do things. Learn a new technique. Start with a new tool. Pick up a new practice. Develop another rule, another condition, another policy. And he said that will take you a little ways, but only so far. But he said if you want to make big changes, you need to change how you see things. You see, just like there's a lot of people that maybe don't want to know exactly the entire process of providing and putting meat on their plate, there's a lot of people that don't believe this happens either. Or it's just isolated events, or it's just because of the perfect storm. And I can tell you that these things aren't necessarily a perfect storm. The gentleman that said this, he's a holistic grazer, practitioner, rancher, educator by the name of Don Campbell. Now, I told you that I was pretty much unqualified to talk about the psychological part of all this, although my experience has been in understanding that if we get the psychological part of it right, the other things seem to have a chance of succeeding. Okay, it's kind of like the Henry Ford comment or quote that says, if you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. Okay, it's a little bit along those lines. If you get a chance, go on to TED Talks, and there's a gentleman, it's down in the corner here by the name of Simon Sinek. And this was a few years ago that I stumbled upon this. And this particular presentation is not necessarily a presentation of his on video. Is not necessarily his own creation, but he calls it basically a codifying what he studied as far as successes, as far as failures, and movement in industry. And he said that most people know what they do. And this is just going to be a real quick synopsis of what he talked about. But most people know what they do. Some of those people know how they do it. Guess what's next in the grayest area on this circle? Very few people, he said, know why they do it. And they will tell you that, well, it's to make money, or it's to produce this product, and he will tell you that no, it's not to make money. Money itself you don't eat, you don't necessarily do much with, it's just an exchange or a currency. He said it's a result of this. If anything, it falls into the what category, but not the why category. The why category actually isn't even in your conscious mind, it's in your subconscious mind. It's who you really are, and it's being able to find that and identify that. And he said people generally have two different tracks that they can take with this set of conditions. The first ones, they can take it from the outside in. They start with what seems to be the most clear, which is an action of some sort, the what. They divide down into how they do that action, in the how, and many times that's where it stops. Okay? Now the other way, and of course this starts with why, which is actually the name of a book that he recently authored, Start with Why. But in this case here, you start with your belief. That then helps identify what knowledge you seek, therefore how you're going to do things, and ultimately floats to the surface what you're going to do and what you're going to produce. But if you don't know why, the values, the morals, the things that you stand for, the things that you believe, how do you know that any of your actions or management actually meet that? Let me give you an example. And it's going to be an example from a sales pitch standpoint. If I do this one, and I start from the outside in, it might sound something like this. I sell grass-fed beef. I utilize rotational grazing, I graze cover crops, I use grass-fed type genetics. You want to buy some beef from me? It's kind of uninspiring, isn't it? It's not real exciting. Now, you know something more about me, but it doesn't really say much. Let's flip that around and let's go from the inside out. I believe that I have been entrusted to take care of this land, and by stewarding it in a regenerative manner to produce high-quality, nutrient-dense food. I utilize rotational grazing, direct marketing, cover crops. I just happen to have grass-fed beef for sale. Is there a little more connection? Now you don't know what I sell, you know why I sell it. And Simon will tell you in his presentation, people don't buy what you do. They buy why you do it. Why do you think everybody keeps saying you need to tell your story? It's because generally in your story, it comes out who you are and why you are, why you do the things that you do. You can tell them all day about the things that you produce, and that doesn't tell them much about the integrity of that product, because the integrity of the product comes from who produced it, and of course that person has an innate why. And the thing is, you don't have to create your why, you have to identify it. Okay, it's kind of like setting your holistic goal if anybody's gone through that process. You don't have to come up with or create who you are, what you stand for. You have to identify it. You already exist. You just have to dig deep to find that. The other thing that it lends itself to is if you just take action. And don't get me wrong, there is a point in time where you just have to jump in and you have to do something, because that's going to be the next step in your learning. But if you just take random actions because someone handed you a recipe or someone told you that it would work or it works for your neighbor, and therefore you take an action, you put in time and energy. Then after you take that action, you get a response, you seek out more knowledge about what happened, even more time and energy and maybe money. And then all of a sudden you get to the point where someone questions you about what you did or how you did it. Then what is it? Human nature generally does what when you get questioned about something? You get defensive. You start trying to find justification. But guess what? If you do that the other way around, it's a totally different approach. You explain who you are and why you do things, and the how and the what is simply a reflection of who you are and why you do those things. Okay? So in this case here, anybody ever feel like you just work and work and work and work? Okay? I fall into that category. My wife would definitely tell you that I fall into that category at times. So are you a human being or are you a human doing? It's the difference sometimes between being a man or woman of action versus a man or woman of contemplation. Okay? Napoleon Hill called it definiteness of purpose in his books versus drifting. Okay? Think there's any people in our society that tend to just drift? I think so. I'm one of them at times. I have to keep coming back to the core in order to figure out and keep identifying with my why. Okay? Let's start with the what category. Let's take what most people consider to be the clearest. And the first thing I want to ask you is, what is your definition of a farmer? You see, in central North Dakota, there was once upon a time that I was pretty sure that to be a bona fide farmer, you needed to be at least 1,500 acres, at least so many crops, at least so much equipment, and preferably a certain color versus another color of equipment. And I had these preconceived notions about what a farmer was. And anybody who didn't meet those thresholds, well, you're just not a real farmer. Now that sounds pretty judgmental on my part. And I didn't necessarily voice those things, but I internalized those things. I felt those things. I judged based on those things. What about your definition of a rancher? Okay? A few years ago, Josh's idea, 2,000 acres of grass plus, or at least 1,500 acres, and then the rest was hayland. You had to have a stock trailer, a diesel pickup, at least one horse or a four-wheeler or something, and that was my definition of a rancher. These things have since changed for me. Let me tell you one example of how it changed in a hurry. I had the opportunity to teach a holistic management introductory class in Minnesota, Mankato, Minnesota, about 3 years ago. And in that class, I did my homework ahead of time, and I found out that everybody in that class, except for one person, operated on a land base that was 10 acres or less. So you guys are already putting together what Josh thinks, definition-wise, of these people. Now, they were wonderful people, but I had pretty much categorized them as gardeners. What, you wouldn't have done the same thing? And guess what I labeled them as and called them or referred to them every time I talked about them as a collective group? Noon on the second day, right before we go to lunch, a gentleman in the back, who's another 6 inches taller than me, comes walking to the front. And he gets right here. Okay? So it wasn't so much like this as it was like this. Okay? And he said, Josh, he said, I have a bone to pick with you. And I said, okay, but I was thinking, holy crap. And he says to me, I have a bone to pick with you. He said, for the first day and a half of this class, he said, you have referred to all of us as gardeners. And I said, I have. And he said, you have offended everyone in here. Oh crap, times 2. And he said, my family farms 5 acres. We raise produce, we raise vegetables. We sell with this marketing method. And he said, we derive our entire family living plus some profit on our 5 acres for our family of 3. Husband, wife, 1 child. He said, Josh, he said, gardeners, not to throw them under the bus, he said, but they aren't necessarily for profit. They have flower beds. They do this for fun. It's a hobby. It's for their own pleasure. He said, I like what I do, but he said, it's for profit. It provides for my family. It feeds other people. He said, Josh, I am not a gardener. I am a vegetable farmer. My definition of farmer has forever been changed. And like I said, it changed like that. So your definition of a farmer, your definition of a rancher, your definition of wealth changes as you go down this road of soil health, as you go down this road of thinking holistically. It changes. And it matters because as you go down this road, and I know the people here from North Dakota that I get to speak to often will tell you that it's interesting, as you go down that road, who jumps on board with you and who sometimes bails on you. And time again, we talk about where do we spend our energy. And I would suggest that we spend our energy with those people that want to get on board. Because you will build, you have the same why as these people. And they don't even have the why because they want to support you. They have the why because it's their own purpose. It's their own driving mechanism. It's their own conviction that they do it. You see, I think agriculture, I know that agriculture is getting divided in general. And to me, it happens on this spectrum. And we have all of these different battles from one side to the other. Okay, it's quantity versus quality. It's conventional versus organic. It's high-tech versus biologics. It's soil health versus making money. And for those of you that have been in that game for a while, you know that the two of those are actually intimately intertwined. It just doesn't happen necessarily right away. And one of the things that I was taught that I didn't really grasp right away, and this is something else that Terry Gopper taught me. He said, Josh, the tendency in this case here is to facilitate this session and create a compromise, right? Okay, how do we compromise? How do we draw the strengths from each and kind of come to the middle. But he said, Josh, he said, there is something that comes before compromise. And he said, that's accommodation. And I'm like, accommodation? How on earth do we do that? And you got to realize that I learned that lesson, or was supposed to learn that lesson, when I was in my first year of marriage. So compromise was the name of the game. But he said accommodation comes first. And he said a good facilitator will take that and try to accommodate as much of the true beliefs of each of those as you can. But surprisingly enough, you could send that group into a back room and this group into a back room and ask them what their what is, and it would probably be different. Ask them what their how is, it would probably be different. And ask them what their why is, and they would tend to come together and they would be an awful lot similar. Now you have some things you agree on. Now you get to work. But you see, just like the Buckminster Fuller quote that Abe brought up, that I know Paul has talked about, that Russ talked about last night, what was the better option rather than trying to fight one or the other? It was to create a whole new path. And as you create that path, people join until what happens? The old reality ceases to exist. The old reality becomes obsolete. And therefore, a lot of your work gets done for you in that process. And I'm going to steal this term right from Paul. There is another alternative. And there's a route that we can really, really take. Now, I don't have all the answers by any means. I don't think anybody does. But as a team, as a group, as a collective whole, I think we can explore that. Some of the things that you will notice in the what category, it's basically production dominated, profit dominated. Here's one of the things that I see often in holistic type managers. Any chance they get to replace money with management to try and achieve the same objective, they do it. Or they will at least try. And like Luke brought up at the tour, he said, I'll try anything at least twice. Why? Because if you're doing something new for the first time and you're the only one in your neighborhood that's doing it, is there a chance that you might not get it quite right the first time? Absolutely. Does that mean it's not worth pursuing again? No, that means that we should probably try it again. One of the things and I bring some of this stuff up because I got to spend, 13 or 14 hours in the car with the Browns on the way down. But one thing that Gabe often says, he said, there is one side of the check that I would rather sign versus the other. Which would you rather sign? The back, wouldn't you? Rather than having to sign the front? Replacing money with management, any chance you get. This is not Missouri. Now, maybe you pile up snow like we do in North Dakota. This is actually the entry road into my family's ranch. This is a few years ago when we had several winters. But one of the things, if you talk to any of the people that have been around in that area for a while and ask them about the weather, eventually they will get to the point where they will tell you about the flood of 66. They'll tell you about the drought of 75, or was it 76? They'll tell you about the drought of 88, 89. They'll tell you about the winter storm of 97. And pretty soon, their management becomes indicative of those worst case scenarios. And what does that do to opportunity? It slowly slips away, and we don't even notice when it shows up. There are opportunities each and every day, each and every season. And do we need a contingency plan for some of those more worst type scenarios? Certainly. But we don't necessarily need to live the worst case scenario every day that it's not actually happening. So what is it, to close out the what portion, what is it that we actually do? And this is going to take a little bit from what Peter Donovan talked about, a little bit from what I've heard Todd Churchill talk about, and it's the idea that's real simple. We're taking solar energy and we're ultimately converting it to human energy. Now, are there a few steps in the middle? Sure. That's where we tend to really complicate things at times. Now, is nature complex? Oh yeah. Way more complex than our human mind will probably ever completely understand. But it doesn't mean that things have to be complicated when we manage. Now that doesn't mean that they're easy, doesn't mean it doesn't come without risk or those sorts of things, but we can do this. So if this is the case, and we believe this, isn't it probably about time that we put the sun to work? Now this actually, and maybe some of you would rather spell sun with an O rather than a U. Okay, that's where it actually came from. And about 5 minutes later, what we did at the beginning of this holistic management class is I had everybody write down their objectives. And they wrote it the other way first. And 5 minutes after I put it up on the wall, because that's where we put the objectives, so we constantly are making sure that we're addressing those things. They said, bring that back down. I've got 2 sons. And his son was sitting there and he goes, Dad, is there some information you need to share with me? Because they have one biological son and one biological daughter. And he said, no, he said, this is like a light bulb moment. And we hadn't, and this is no credit to me because I hadn't even started teaching or anything yet. And he said, we actually have another son that we better put to work. Because if there is one free lunch, and that's maybe debatable, but if there is one free lunch that we can take advantage of, it's this son right here. And every day that we don't, it's every day that value escapes us. How about the how part of this? Okay, we've gone through the what. Now let's dig down a little bit deeper. Let's get into the how. How do you graze? What's your recipe? Which one of these is right? She's shaking her head over here. Okay, let me ask you a different way. Which one of these is wrong? Now, in any given situation, there's probably going to be one that's more right or more wrong, depending on a vast number of conditions. But this is the how. You want to know how many debates over the years I've gotten into with different people about the how? And we haven't even gotten to the deepest level yet. You see, in the end, I'm really grazing for ecosystem health. And I might use any and all of these sorts of things, these different methods, depending on what we're trying to accomplish, what our goals and objectives are. And there's some of these that I tend to not use very often, if at all. There's some of these that I use quite frequently, but that's my situation. And I've identified the why and the how and the what, and therefore this sort of thing kind of figures itself out. Whoops. Some people are not comfortable with simply being the early adopter or innovator. If you've ever seen that bell curve, okay, where it talks about the innovators, the early adopters, the early majority, late majority, and the laggards, okay, the ones they'll die before they change, okay, let's just put it that way. Not everybody's comfortable making that initial step, taking that risk without anything proven or without anybody else that's already done it. But there are some. So for those who aren't, I don't want to give you a recipe, but through the idea of principles, I can maybe give you a recipe-ish. Okay? And therefore it's kind of how you would do something-ish. Okay? Basically the ish is what covers my butt. Okay? Because my job, whenever I do any consulting or visiting and that sort of stuff, is not to tell you what to do, how to do it, when to do it. It's to empower the people that I get to work with to make decisions on your own. I think for far too long, we have either accepted or been forced into doing what other people tell us. And I really think that we need to take the power of decision-making back, but also feel confident in being able to make those decisions, those sustainable type decisions, and also being okay if it doesn't go quite right. I've been in some situations where I've told people what to do, when to do it, how to do it, and guess what? When it didn't work, whose fault was it? It was mine. Well, that's not really how I wanted this to be. I wanted to be a part of your team for a day. I don't want to be your dictator for a day. Okay? These principles have been covered several times throughout the last 3 days, out in the outdoor classroom and in the indoor classroom, so I won't necessarily go through those. But I do want to talk about what I like to call the SPA complex. Okay, and SPA stands for soil, plant, animal, human. You see, when I was a little kid, all I ever wanted to be was a cowboy. Okay? Anybody ever see the movie The Man from Snowy River? Okay? Now, I wasn't, at 5 and 6 and 8 years old, I wasn't really interested in the fact that it was a romance, okay? But it was the hat, it was the horse, it was the saddle, it was the high speeds, it was the mountain. Josh wanted to be a cowboy. As I got a little bit older, had to take on some responsibility, I realized that just being a cowboy probably wasn't going to get me where I wanted to go. So then I decided, well, maybe I need to be a rancher. Well, that lasted for a little while, and then I had some influence from some other people, and they said, well, you probably need to extend that. So I thought, well, maybe I need to be a grass farmer. So then I tried to take that next step and learn as much about it as I could. But that wasn't it. Okay, I wasn't done yet. Because after that, then I finally got to the point where I'm like, I really think I need to be a soil microbe manager. And I'm not so sure that that's where the story's going to end. But you see, as I stepped through each of those processes, I was stepping from the top down. That's where my emphasis was. Okay, it was the cowboy, it was the human part, it was the rancher, it was the animal part, it was the grass farmer, it was the plant component, it was the soil microbe manager or the soil component. Except, what do you think about the stability of that model? What generally has to take place in order for that model to stay upright? All of a sudden you need some crutches. Okay, it's kind of like framing up a house, and you have half of it framed up and you know a storm's coming. What do? They put up braces. Okay? Or on our place, once in a while, you have that old barn that just hasn't quite fallen down yet, and you just don't want it to happen this weekend. So you put that frame up. You put those crutches up. But guess what? Those crutches come free? No, generally not. And don't get me wrong, I know some pretty creative people that utilize resources on their place, and more power to them. But in general, you still have a fragile system. You've just built your house of cards a little bit more stable. What could we do instead? Could we not build it the other way? Could we not start with the soil as that foundation and build it upward, one after another? And this isn't to take away the influence of us as humans, but wouldn't you rather be on top of this pyramid rather than on top of the other top-heavy one? Now, if you notice, I have two words at the bottom here, technology and biology. And I don't want you to get the impression that I'm anti-technology or that the answer is always biology, but I tend to think we get those turned around many times. If you need to go fix a problem, and trust me, the engineer in me always wants to fix a problem. For years, I was trying to fix everything that nature screwed up. Guess how many times I won? Technology is quick, it's convenient, it's easy. Quite honestly, other than the cheapness part once in a while, it's kind of like our food supply in general. It's not always the answer. That being said, there's lots of technological advances that can really help us to monitor and to accelerate things, to accomplish things that we wouldn't necessarily be able to accomplish as quickly or as easily as before. But when we start replacing biology with technology, I think it gets real dangerous. And I don't think there's any stronger representation of that than listening to Dr. Huber this morning. And for those of you, which I'm assuming most of you sat through that, it's as sobering each time you listen to it as it was the previous time, if not more. At least that's my opinion. Question down here, which diagram best represents your operation or your business in general? It doesn't even have to be an agricultural operation. How about this one? Do you believe your actions or your management can be 100% efficient and 0% effective? Now this is pretty extreme, right? So I don't know that we'd ever get to this extreme, but to illustrate the point, is it possible that you can be doing everything you're doing really, really well, but you're not doing any of the right things? To me, and that's a good point, to me effectiveness is about going in the right direction and shooting at the right target. I can hit the bullseye over and over and over and over again, but if I'm not even shooting at the right target, that's not going to matter. Okay? If I'm going really, really fast, going down the wrong road, all I'm going to do is go broke sooner. Okay? Which isn't going to lead to profitability quicker. So the idea is that establish the direction, shoot at the right target, even if you have to go slow at first. Then you can work on becoming more and more efficient, faster, more power, more rate of speed, those sorts of things. This question, to me, applies to the greatest extent from a time standpoint. Okay? Does anybody have more than 24 hours in a day? Gabe? Yeah, I know, because you sleep like -2 per night. How many would like some more hours in the day? Or at least more wake hours in the day? Sometimes in my household, with a 1-year-old and a 2-year-old, I'd actually like more sleep hours in a day. But it's one thing to try and be efficient with your time. If you have 10 things that you get done in a day right now, and you figure out how to do 8 things in that same amount of time, what do you do with that space, that open space of 2 things? You just add 2 more things in there. So are you more efficient? Sure. Have you met your goals? Depends. Okay? But the whole idea is if you are effective with your time, if you are effective just like your water cycle, just like your mineral cycle, just like your collection of solar energy, all those things, if they're effective, it's starting to go down the right road, and pretty soon it will start to get more efficient as you move forward. So to me, getting back to the definition part, I don't believe that agriculture is an efficient, or at least it shouldn't be, an efficient industrial process for producing a high quantity commodity. What do I think it is? Or what would I like it to be? What Josh thinks it maybe should be is an effective biological process for producing high quality food. It often gets said in the agricultural community that many consumers are so disconnected from our food supply. Guess who else is disconnected from our food supply? I probably don't have to answer that for you. Reconnecting with that food supply is ultimately important, and I would guess that most people in here are, or you're moving in that direction. But you're treating agriculture very differently. You're defining it very differently than how other people or the masses might. Right now in western North Dakota, it's the land of oil. Okay, it's the land of sometimes mass confusion. And don't get me wrong, there's pros and cons that come along with that, but growing phases and infrastructure and all those sorts of things. Why do I bring that up? A lot of the wars and battles and those sorts of things that we've fought in the last however many years were about that. I honestly think that those will pale in comparison when the wars and battles become about water. But here's the hopeful part. Even though agriculture has some things that it needs to fix, many times lots of things, unlike a lot of other industries or businesses, even though agriculture is part of the problem, they also can completely be the solution. How many other businesses or industries can claim that the exact problems that they create, many of them maybe unintentionally, can turn around and say, hey, we can turn this around and we can actually be the solution and lead the way into the future? When the rain comes, will your soil be drinking or will it be spilling? Now, I've heard many times that the rain stops at the creek, stops at my neighbor's fence line, it won't cross the road. Nobody else has ever heard that? When we did the rainfall simulator, when Doug was explaining the rainfall simulator, one of the things that came to my mind and I shared it with the group that I was with, is that sometimes, or many times actually, I hear a producer say, "Wow, we just got a 1/4 inch, that wasn't even worth it." Why wouldn't it be worth it? Because they were so ineffective in their use of that moisture, they had to get an inch in order to feel like they got a 1/4 inch. Every 32nd of an inch, I want to go into my property, into my real estate, which, by the way, is 3-dimensional. Okay? Whenever you describe your farm or your ranch, how do you often describe it? When somebody says, "Well, tell me what size is your ranch, or what size is your farm?" What do you tell them? Or what are the units that you use? Acres, hectares. If you're in a smaller type setting, maybe square feet, square yards. But what are all of those units? They're 2-dimensional, right? Throw them for a loop sometime and tell them about the depth. Tell them about your organic matter. Tell them about the 4th dimension. 4th dimension, boy, that guy from North Dakota is really smoking something now, isn't he? The 4th dimension to me is the biological life. It's the thing that makes everything else worth it, the thing that makes everything else function. This is a quote I often like to use in a presentation. It says, "As to methods, there may be a million and then some, but principles are few. But the man or woman who grasps principles can successfully select their own methods." Is there one right way to do things? No. But is there generally a set of underlying principles that you can get started with and to follow? Certainly. And this leads me to something that I've believed for quite some time now. And I've worked for a conservation agency or organization for my entire career up to this point. And I don't believe conservation's enough. I really don't. Because what does conservation do? It minimizes the loss, right? Are you interested in just having a slow drain on your place rather than a fast drain? I'm not. It doesn't interest me. If there is a wound, if there is an injury, not only do I want to stop the bleeding, but I want to heal it and I want to make it stronger than it was before. We saw 2 operations on Wednesday where they didn't stop at conservation. They're still moving forward. And I don't know where the limit is or if there is one. But if we wanted to even use this word sustainable, which in my opinion has lost a lot of its integrity because it gets used to describe darn near anything these days. It's more of a marketing term than anything. But if you truly believe that something can be sustainable in the future, I think we have to regenerate what's degraded in the first place to actually get it to a level that it can provide for the basic needs that all of us need. A degraded state is probably not going to accomplish that just by minimizing the loss. How many remember this picture? I tell you what, this young lady has this type of picture, or at least, her name is Audrey Rose, by the way, Audrey Rose Oswald. And her father is in the audience today. In fact, he's sitting right back there. Daryl, you want to raise your hand? And Daryl, of course, has used Audrey as a reference point many times, and of course, the only thing you got to be careful is she doesn't stop growing. So the cover crops, will tend to look a little bit shorter over time. But it's gotten a lot of mileage. And it's not so much the reference point as, look at that smile. Now, I think it was Picasso that said that every child's born an artist. It's just a matter of keeping that mindset or that spirit. I think that spirit has continued because let me show you something a little more recent. There's not only a learning process that I believe is happening here, but there's an appreciation process that is developing. And by the way, it wasn't too many weeks ago that I actually got to ride horse on this place, and we sorted cows, and she was right there with her dad and the rest of us, learning, appreciating, experiencing. Okay? But you see, it's that next generation that's going to have their work cut out for them. But guess what we can do until that point? We can cut our own swath through this thing. And we can do something about it, and it affects every aspect of our society, all of these included. It's not just agriculture, okay? How many people in this country eat food? I hope everybody. Now, I know there are some issues, and I know the justification to feed the world's a real big thing right now, but I think it's a little more complex than we just need to grow some more corn and beans in a few states and we'll fix that problem, right? That's a pretty shallow view of trying to feed this population that we talk about of what, 9 billion in the next 20 to 30 years. Anybody recognize that picture? You guys recognize that picture? Remember that little copter that was flying with a camera on it? Now, I'd play the video if we had a little bit more time, but I want to get through this. Cattle, people, green grass, soils. Does it get any better than that? And then some education on top of it, networking on top of that. And you see, to me, the common denominator through all this gets filtered through one thing. The microbes, the plants, the animals, the people, they all get filtered through healthy soil. And if they get filtered through healthy soil, the outcomes are awesome. Now, if they get filtered through something that's toxic, something that's dead, something that's sterile, something that's just dirt, these outcomes are different, aren't they? We know that. We don't need any research to prove that. We see it. We feel it. We know it. Healthy soil is this ultimate buffer, this ultimate filter towards good things. And we have the distinct privilege of being able to manage towards that. There was a gentleman at a conference a few weeks ago, and he was from South Dakota, and his concern was all of the grasslands that are being tilled under, and of course seeded to corn, beans, that sort of thing in his area. And he said, I feel like I'm constantly looking over my shoulder. And I believe that he is, or that he feels that way. I feel that way, that I'm constantly looking over my shoulder, thinking that this thing just isn't getting any better. But if I'm looking over my shoulder, guess who has to actually stare it in the face at some point in time? The next generation, right? Now, as much confidence as I hope I have in my kids someday, I don't necessarily think that they should have to take it on all themselves when we still have time to do something. And they can carry the torch, but if we wait till they're maybe ready to start and then say, okay, here you go, now fix it, we might be too far gone. Now, again, I don't want to be doom and gloom, but I think a little bit of urgency might be a healthy thing in this scenario. Okay, we talked last night. Russ explained some things where there's a timeline on certain things, and if we have some opportunities, what can we do to go after some of those particular opportunities? Now, I know I'm repeating this again, but I just think it's ultimately powerful. This again is Buckminster Fuller. He said, you never change things by fighting the existing reality. And that's the human nature thing to do. Find what you don't like and fight it. But instead, manage for what you want instead of managing for what you don't want. If every day you got to take that approach, a positive approach, an exciting approach, an approach that attracts like-minded people, can you imagine how much different that is than fighting the grind, fighting the things you don't like? I tell you what, it's a whole lot more fun to grow grass than it is to hate weeds. It really is. And that's a pretty elementary example, but we can apply that to so many different levels that we have. There's a book that I'm reading right now. It's called Unhypnosis by Dr. Gary Taubman. And the reason that I was attracted to this book is not because I was necessarily interested in hypnosis or that sort of thing, but what he talks about in that book is, he said, because of what our society tends to do, he believes that most people over time actually get hypnotized by society. And that to truly free yourself to be who you want to be, you actually have to take the reverse approach and unhypnotize yourself. Okay? This is why I think that agriculture is not just agriculture, it's agri-culture. And cultures have a certain way of doing things. And in many cultures, if you don't abide by the rules, what happens? You're exactly right. We either create a new culture, or we can fight the existing culture. In this book, it just brings to light some of the things that we don't necessarily consider. Most of us in here, including me, I wouldn't consider myself to be hypnotized, but I also know that I've gone through a process of unlearning some of the things that I used to think were true, and in the process, I think I've kind of unhypnotized along the way. Let me tell you a quick story, and this is the never, never, never story. My wife and I met a little over 10 years ago. And we met at a 4th of July party, a mutual friend. It was at the lake. Okay, so we're all wearing lake-type clothes. 2 weeks later was the first time that she saw a picture of me in a cowboy hat. And she tells me today that she was this close to saying, that's it. I'm out. I'm never going to marry a farmer. So logically, about a year and a half later, we got married. In a few years, or another year after that, she said, you know, I never wanted to live in North Dakota. It's too cold, there's too many bugs, you have 2 seasons, winter and road construction. I'm never going to live in North Dakota. So about 3 months later, we bought our first house in Bismarck, North Dakota. About 2 years ago, she told me, and I'm not trying to throw my wife under the bus because she's an amazing person. We've been through a lot from a health standpoint, from a career standpoint, various other things with our family. And she's a wonderful wife, an amazing mother. But she told me, she said, Josh, she said, I know what your interests are, but she said, I will never, ever move to the farm. So next year, we're moving to the family farm. But the key to this whole thing is not that I kept her from going to Arizona, or that I'm some sort of person that she just whatever, goes along with whatever. It's because her view of agriculture was very conventional and very much wanted nothing to do with it. And as we went through challenges, as we started questioning everything, including our food, including our care of our land, our education system, all the things all the way through, we decided that this was the right move for us. And we're all in. Now there will be challenges, no doubt. These 2 little creatures, they had a little bit to do with it as well. Okay? They will change your lives in a hurry. At least they did mine, and of course they're only about 15 months apart in age, so we went from a pretty quiet house to a little bit of a circus. But that's kind of tends to be our thing. But we changed our mind and we think holistically, and that makes a big, big difference. And I'm going to try and play a little short video for, it's like 20 seconds. 1,100 was my example from that video. 1,100 is the amount of times their own weight that the average dung beetle can lift. Guess what we've probably got ahead of us? Some heavy lifting. But I don't know of a better group that can probably do this. Now 1,100 times, it's probably not capable with any individual. But we have to think bigger. Now you might be the type that to move forward you might need a cheerleader. Okay, I'm kind of a words of affirmation type person. So I need those types of things. I had a friend in high school that I played basketball with that he didn't care if you told him good job. He wanted you to trash talk him because it fired him up. So if that's the type of person that you are, I dare you. In fact, I double dog dare you. Doug Peterson, I actually got that from you. He used that one time at a workshop that we had, and it really brought to light that everybody's got different motivations, different triggers. We just got to pull the right trigger in order to make that happen. I want to end with one story, and then we're done. If we really want to talk about sustainability, I don't think we have to go much further than this group right here. About 4 years ago, I had the opportunity to give or facilitate a pasture walk for youth. Now, I'm used to giving pasture walks to farmers and ranchers, and we all know what the average age of farmers and ranchers are for the most part. Okay? So I asked my wife, who's a 7th and 8th grade English teacher, what am I going to do? And she said, the biggest thing you're going to have trouble with is attention span. Okay, what do? She said, you need a few tricks. I thought, okay, I can do that. So I went out to this ranch. I found some cow pies to make sure there was dung beetles. I thought, everybody likes bugs, right? So I got it. I found it. It was on a well-managed ranch. They had lots of dung beetles. So that was my ace. So 5 minutes into the 3-hour pasture walk, Josh panics, because one little kid was off chasing a mouse over there, and 2 were over here giggling. And so I show him the dung beetles. If you want to see a 31-year-old guy get thrown out of the way by a bunch of 11 and 12-year-olds, it's pretty much what happened. They were so excited to see those dung beetles. And we had about a 200-acre pasture that we were looking at. For the rest of the day, I probably wouldn't have had to say one thing. It looked like a bunch of badgers had covered that pasture, overturned every cow pie. And of course, you don't exactly uncover cow pies and stay clean, right? I have no idea what they told their parents that night about what they learned, but they sure were excited. And I'm not so sure that they needed to know stocking rate, or that they needed to do the calculations, or that they needed to do the plant ID. They just needed to be excited. You see, it's not about the land or the money or the equipment that you might pass on to the next generation. It's about whether they even want to come back in the first place. And I think it's Joel Salatin that talks about romancing the next generation back to the farm or the ranch. Because I don't want them to end up like this. Father says, or son says to his father, he says, I'm leaving home to seek my fortune. And the father says, what about the livestock in the fields, in the barn? He says, I already looked there. I want these guys to look again. But I want them to look again through a different set of eyes and see it differently. See it for what it can be, not what everybody else tells them it has to be. And by doing that, it can be much, much different. Keeping in mind that the last of the old way is always easier than the first of the new, but that does not make it not worth pursuing. Anybody in here willing to be a black sheep if the opportunity comes about? How many of you are already black sheep? That's probably a better question. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been a privilege to visit with you. I have enjoyed the one-on-one conversations, the tours, both days of the conference. I hope that you will keep us in mind next year. We're moving to another part of the country, and we want to keep moving it around. Michigan's the place next year. And I think it's going to be an exciting conference. We're going to look at a different environment. We're September 16th through the 18th in 2015, Mount Pleasant, Michigan. And I hope I see a lot of you before then. But if not, please consider coming and joining us. We would be honored to have you. Thank you for coming, and we'll see you.